The mailbag was hanging from the saloon hook, frozen stiff, with no horse tied outside and no rider in the street. That was what made Asher Crowe put down his coffee. Coldwater Spur had not seen a mail rider in 3 winters. The relay line had been dead since the copper mines failed, and the telegraph wire east of town hung in black loops from its poles like old rope. Nobody used the brass hook outside Mercer's saloon anymore except drunk men steadying themselves before they stepped into the snow. But there it was. A leather mailbag, crusted white with ice, swinging lightly in the wind. The storm had buried Front Street past the wagon ruts. Snow pressed against the dark windows of the Mercantile. The church bell was wrapped in frost. Across the street, the old relay office leaned under the weight of winter, its sign half gone, its door nailed shut since before Asher's youngest brother had grown a beard. Inside the saloon, no one spoke. Mercer stood behind the bar with a towel in his hand, and fear already working its way into his face. Nolan Crowe, sitting beside Asher, turned his head slowly toward the window. Bram stopped sharpening his knife against the heel of his boot. Kit, the youngest, leaned forward as if the bag might vanish if he blinked. That line's closed, Mercer said. Asher rose. The chair scraped once across the floor. Stay inside, he said. Nobody argued. Not even Mercer. The wind hit Asher in the chest the moment he opened the door. It carried hard snow and pine dust from the ridge, sharp enough to make his eyes water. He stepped onto the porch, one hand braced against the rail, and looked both ways down the street. No horse, no wagon, no fresh tracks that belonged to a rider. Only one narrow drag mark leading from the dark end of town to the saloon steps. Already filling with snow, Nolan came out behind him despite being told not to. Asher, I see it. The drag mark stopped below the hook. Asher reached for the mailbag. The leather cracked under his fingers. The lock was not a post office lock. It was old brass, stamped with the mark of the Coldwater relay. A pine tree, a lightning line, and the number 7. His throat tightened. That key had been missing for 11 years. He took the bag down and carried it inside. Mercer backed away from it as if Asher had brought in a live coal. The brothers gathered around the nearest table. Asher set the bag down gently, then pulled the small key from the chain around his neck. It had belonged to his cousin Peter, who had died on a winter route no one in town liked to discuss. The key turned. Inside the bag was no mail. There was a strip of oilcloth, a torn piece of map, a black bone button, and a folded scrap of linen with 3 words written in brown pencil. Not the sheriff. Kit swallowed. What does that mean? Before Asher could answer, the wind pushed the saloon door open again. This time, it brought a woman with it. She was on the porch, one arm braced against the frame, her dark hair frozen loose around her face. A dead man's coat hung from her shoulders, too large for her, stiff with weather. She was not crying. She was not calling for help. She was trying to stand long enough to see whether the mailbag had made it inside. Her eyes found Asher, pale, alert, almost angry that her body was failing before her mind had finished its work. Mercer whispered, "No strangers in this weather." Asher did not look at him. The woman's lips moved. No sound came at first. Asher stepped closer but stopped before touching her. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" She stared past him at the bag on the table. Then she forced out a voice thin as thread. "Don't call the sheriff." Her knees gave. Bram moved first, but Asher lifted a hand and stopped him. Not because he meant to leave her there, because the woman had flinched before Bram even reached her. Like she had learned the cost of fast hands. Asher crouched in the snow, blown across the floor. "My name is Asher Crowe," he said. "You're in Coldwater Spur." Her gaze sharpened at his name. For 1 second, something like relief passed through her face. Then fear swallowed it. They followed the bag. She whispered. Nolan went still behind him. "Who did?" The woman looked at the frozen windows, the locked doors, the silent men, the iron choir. Mercer made a sound under his breath. Asher had not heard that name spoken in Coldwater Spur since his father was alive. The woman's hand found his sleeve. Her fingers were cold, but her grip still had command in it. "If you take me to town law," she said. "I'm already gone." Asher looked at the mailbag. Then at the drag mark disappearing under fresh snow. Then at his brothers. Outside. Far down the white street. A horse stamped once in the dark. Not close. Not far enough. Asher stood. "Nolan," he said. "Check the back alley. Brom. Get the horses from Mercer's shed. Kit. Take the bag." Mercer stepped forward. "Asher. Whatever this is." Asher turned on him. "Forget you saw her." The old saloon keeper looked at the woman on the floor. Then at the bag. Then at the storm outside. "I won't remember a thing," he said. Asher lifted the woman carefully, leaving room for her to pull away if she still had strength. She did not. But before her eyes closed, she whispered one last thing into his coat. "My name is Veyne. And somewhere beyond Coldwater Spur, under the broken telegraph wire, men who had been paid to wait were watching the snow cover their tracks." Veyne woke to the sound of wire tapping against glass. At first, she thought it was a telegraph key. Her hand moved before her eyes opened, reaching beneath the blanket for a weapon that was not there. Her fingers found rough wool, a patched quilt, and the edge of a narrow cot. No blade. No pistol. No hidden pin in the seam. Then she remembered the snow. The mailbag. The man named Asher Crowe. She opened her eyes. The room was small, built of dark pine logs, with a low stove glowing in the corner. A cracked window looked out on a wall of white timber. On the table beside her sat the brass relay lock, the torn map, the black bone button, and a tin cup of broth no one had forced into her hands. That mattered. People who meant to own you always place things in your hands before telling you the price. Across the room, a man sat near the door with a rifle resting across his knees. Not pointed at her. Not careless either. He had broad shoulders, sandy hair, and eyes that looked too awake for a man pretending not to watch. "You are Bram," she said. His eyebrows lifted. "You were asleep when I came in. You step heavy on your left heel." He looked down at his boot, almost offended. "Nobody ever told me that." They weren't listening. The door opened before Bram could answer. Asher Crowe stepped in with a gust of cold behind him. He shut the door quickly, then set a folded coat on the chair near the stove. He did not come close to the cot. "You've been out since before dawn," he said. "How long?" "Most of a day." Mara turned her head toward the window. "Where am I?" "Old Coldwater relay cabin. Half a mile behind town. Nobody uses it." "Someone used it." Asher's eyes moved to the brass lock. "Once." She tried to sit up. Pain caught her fast enough to steal the breath from her. Bram stood. But Asher raised one hand. Bram stopped. Mara noticed that too. Asher waited until she could breathe again. "You're not ready to move." "I did not ask what I was ready for." "No. You asked where you were." For the first time. She looked at him properly. He was older than Bram by more than years. There was a steadiness in him that did not come from comfort. Men like that had either buried people, failed people, or carried both facts under their ribs until they became bone. "Did you call the sheriff?" she asked. "No." "Doctor?" "No." "Town marshal?" "There isn't one worth the word." Her mouth tightened. "Good." Asher pulled the chair closer, but not close enough to crowd her. He sat with his forearms on his knees and looked at the objects on the table. "I'm going to ask you one question first," he said. Mara waited. "Not whether you are innocent." That made her still. His voice did not soften. "If you die, who benefits?" For a moment, the only sound was the wind dragging loose wire across the window frame. Mara looked away. Most men asked whether she had been wronged, whether she had been taken, Whether she had killed. Whether she deserved mercy. Questions built to make the asker feel clean. Asher's question was uglier. And more useful. The Iron Choir. She said. Bram's face changed. Asher did not move. What are they? A church name for men who never pray. That is not an answer. No. Mara said. It is what they want people to say. The answer is freight theft. Bought sheriffs. False banknotes. Land seizures. Missing witnesses. And enough money to put honest men in rooms where honesty starts to look expensive. Bram muttered something low. Asher kept his eyes on her. And you? Mara's fingers curled against the blanket. I kept their maps. Maps of what? Routes. Guard changes. Railroad schedules. Which ranches had men gone for winter? Which towns had sheriffs who could be paid to sleep late? Bram took one step back as if the floor had shifted. Mara did not blame him. I was not a hostage with clean hands. She said. If that is what you need me to be. Put me back in the snow. Asher's jaw tightened. But he did not look away. What changed? A small laugh left her. Dry and without humor. A boy on a freight car who was not supposed to be touched. The room went quiet. She did not give them the rest. Not yet. The boy's face belonged to her punishment. And she had not earned the ease of sharing it. Instead. She nodded toward the mailbag. I sent 2 packets before I ran. One west to a lawyer who does not know what he has. One east to a Pinkerton man who does. That map is part of the 3rd. Without me. It is scrap. With me. It can put names beside receipts. Asher picked up the torn map but did not unfold it fully. Where does it lead? A cattle barn near 3 Forks. Bram gave a humorless breath. Of course it does. Mara looked at him. You know it. I know barns that don't smell like cattle usually belong to bad men. For 1 weak second. She almost smiled. Asher saw it and said nothing. Then a knock sounded from outside. 2 taps. A pause. 1 tap. Bram opened the door just enough for Nolan Crowe to slip in. Snow on his hat and concern in his eyes. No tracks from town. Nolan said. But the telegraph wire west of the cabin's been cut. Mara closed her eyes. Asher looked at her. That bad? No. She said quietly. That means they don't want ordinary messages leaving. She opened her eyes again. It also means their messages still can. Nolan laid the piece of telegraph wire on the table. It was no longer than his forearm. Black with weather. Bright at both ends where metal had been freshly exposed. He set it beside the brass relay lock and looked at Mara as if she might bite him for asking the wrong thing. Somebody cut it west of the cabin. He said. Then twisted it back loose enough to fool a man from the road. Asher leaned over the wire. Meaning? Meaning from town it looks broken by storm. Nolan said. But it wasn't storm. Mara reached for the wire. Bram moved as if to stop her. Then checked himself. She noticed. She always noticed. Her fingers closed around the cold metal. She turned it once. Slowly. Studying the cut. This was done with a lineman's jaw cutter. She said. Not a knife. Not fence pliers. Nolan's eyes narrowed. You can tell that from looking. I have paid men to make things look like accidents. The words settled into the cabin harder than the snow against the roof. Kit Crowe, who had been standing near the stove with his arms folded, looked away first. He was young enough that disgust still showed before he could bury it. Mara handed the wire back. They cut the common line. She said. The one merchants and ranchers would use. But if they left the ground return intact. A private pulse can still move through a secondary key. Asher stared at her. Can you use it? Not from here. Not yet. But they can. Yes. The stove popped once. Outside. Wind dragged snow across the shutters in long white fingers. Nolan pulled off his gloves. There's more. Asher turned. Found tracks by the South Pole. 2 men. One heavy. One lighter. The lighter man wore maid boots. Narrow heel. City leather. Not miner's boots. Not ranch boots. Mara went still. Asher saw it before she could hide it. You know who that is. She looked at the black bone button on the table. Maybe. That is not an answer. No. She said. It is the best I can give until I know whether your brother saw a rounded heel or a cut square. Nolan reached into his coat pocket and dropped a small clump of packed snow onto the table. Pressed into it was the shape he had preserved beneath his scarf. A sharp square heel. Too neat for frontier work. Mara's face lost what little color it had. Julian Rusk. She said. Kit frowned. Who's Julian Rusk? For a breath. She looked at the stove instead of them. My mother's son. The cabin changed around that sentence. Bram's hand lowered from the back of his chair. Nolan stopped rubbing warmth into his fingers. Even Asher's eyes shifted. Not with surprise exactly. But with the care of a man stepping onto thin river ice. Your brother works for them? Asher asked. He belonged to them before I did. Belonged. Mara looked at him then. The Iron Choir does not hire children. Mr. Crowe. It keeps them. No one spoke. She continued because stopping would have been easier. And she did not trust easy things. Julian was taken first. 2 years later. He told them where to find me. I hated him for it. Then I became useful enough to understand what fear can make a child do. Kit's anger faltered. That bothered him. And he turned it back into suspicion. So he followed you here. No. Mara said. If Julian is here. He did not follow me. He came to confirm whether I was still breathing. Asher stood slowly. Nolan pointed toward the window. If he has the line. He has already sent word. Mara shook her head. Julian does not trust wires. Not for things that matter. He rides the message himself. If he saw the bag reach Coldwater Spur. He went south before dawn. To who? Bram asked. To 6 men, waiting near Bozeman. Maybe more. If Hiram Voss is frightened. Kit gave a hard laugh. 6 men don't frighten me. They should. Mara said. Not because they are brave. Because they will not care what stands between them and the work. Asher looked toward the cabin door. Toward the town hidden beyond the trees. Toward the road that climbed back to the Crow Ranch. How long? Mara did the arithmetic in silence. Miles. Snow depth. Horse changes. A cautious man's pace. Then she closed her eyes. I thought we had 5 days. Nolan's face tightened. And now? If Julian left before dawn, she said, they can reach the mouth of your canyon by tomorrow night. Kit swore under his breath. Bram looked at Asher. We fortify the ranch. No. Mara said. All 5 men turned to her. She gripped the edge of the cot and forced herself upright. Though the effort turned her voice thin. If you take me to your ranch and wait. They will burn your hay. Cut your horses loose. And make the house a box. They do not have to win clean. They only have to make everyone else afraid to help the next witness. Asher's face hardened. My father built that house. Then do not let them choose it as his grave. The words struck Kit first. He looked ready to answer. But Asher lifted one hand. Not now. Not from anger. He crossed to the table and picked up the brass relay key. For a moment. He held it like something heavier than metal. There's an old trail east of the relay line. He said. Cuts through timber. Comes out above the Madison. Nolan looked at him. In this snow. In this snow. Bram understood first. We leave before they arrive. Kit stared at his oldest brother. Leave the ranch. Asher looked at Mara. No. He said. We leave them a house to search. Cold stove. Empty beds. No woman. No bag. Mara held his gaze. For the first time since waking. She did not look hunted. She looked like someone watching a bad map being corrected. Outside. Under the cut wire. The storm kept covering tracks. Inside. Asher Crowe said. Pack light. We move before moonrise. They left Coldwater Spur with no lanterns. The town slept behind them, buried under snow and fear, while the Crowe brothers moved like men carrying a secret that could wake the whole valley if dropped. Nolan rode ahead. Bram watched the rear. Kit led the pack horse with the mailbag tied beneath a rolled blanket. Theo kept close to Mara. Not because she asked him to, but because her breathing had gone too careful. Asher rode beside her without speaking. That silence was the first mercy. The old relay trail bent east behind the abandoned office, then climbed into timber, so thick the snow fell in quiet pieces instead of sheets. Broken poles appeared every few hundred yards, half swallowed by pine and weather. Some still held loops of dead wire. Others leaned like tired men who had waited too long for a message that never came. Mara looked at them as they passed. "You knew this trail?" Asher said. "I knew it on paper. That is not the same thing." "No," she said. "Paper does not tell you where a horse loses courage." Asher glanced at her then. She was sitting too straight. That was how he knew she was hurting. People in real pain did not always bend. Sometimes they became rigid, as if pride could hold bone and breath together. After another mile, her horse stumbled in a drift. Mara caught the saddle horn, but the movement pulled the strength from her face. She said nothing. She only lowered her head for 1 second and lifted it again. Asher pulled his horse to a stop. "We change saddles." She looked at him. "Why?" "Mine rides softer." "I did not ask." "No." He swung down and began loosening the cinch. Kit stopped ahead of them. "Asher. We don't have time. We have time to keep her in the saddle." Mara's mouth tightened. "I can ride." "I know." "Then don't make a ceremony of it." "I'm not." He lifted his saddle down and carried it to her horse. No speech. No pity. No hand at her waist unless she chose to take it. When she dismounted, she nearly lost her footing. And Bram stepped forward. She raised one hand. Bram stopped. Asher did not look pleased about her pain. But he did not argue with it either. He only adjusted the stirrup leather shorter, checked the blanket twice, and stepped back. Mara watched him. Most men made kindness into a debt. Asher Crowe made it into a completed task. That was harder to distrust. They rode until the moon thinned behind cloud and the trees opened around a leaning line shack. The roof sagged on one side. Snow had packed itself against the north wall. A rusted stove waited inside, full of old ash and a bird's nest long abandoned. Bram cleared the pipe. Nolan checked the trees. Kit brought in wood from a dry stack under the eaves. Theo put Mara on a bench near the stove and gave her coffee in a tin cup. She held it with both hands. Asher stood at the doorway, watching the trail they had come from. "No tracks will hold by morning." Nolan said. "They don't need tracks if Julian knows this line." Mara said. Asher turned. "Does he?" "No. But he knows me. He will know I hate dead ends." Kit crouched near the fire. "Then we better stop being one." Mara looked at him for a long moment. Then she set the coffee down. "Bring me that saddle." Everyone looked at Asher's old saddle near the wall. Asher picked it up and carried it over. Mara turned it, found the worn underside, and took a charred stick from the stove edge. On the old leather, she began to draw. Not pretty lines. Useful ones. Roads. Fence cuts. A barn near Three Forks. A loading chute. A corn crib east of the main structure. "The vault is under the third stall from the south," she said. "Not the barn office. That is what they want men to search." Nolan crouched beside the map. "Guards. 2 at the main door. 1 in the loft. 1 inside near the trap. But the dangerous part is not them." "What is?" "The books." Kit frowned. "Books don't shoot." "No." Mara said. "Books make men think they can." She marked 3 places with short black strokes. "These are not just ledgers. There will be railroad waybills. Brand registry copies. Telegraph codes. If we take only one. Hiram Voss calls it forged. If we take all three. The lie has to fight itself. Asher watched her hand move across the leather. You've had this planned a long time. Longer than I have had the courage to do it. That answer quieted the room. The fire grew warmer. Snow slid softly from the roof. Asher reached into his coat and took out the brass relay key. He placed it beside her hand on the saddle leather. Mara looked up. That belonged to someone you loved. She said. Yes. Then, don't give it to me. I'm not giving it. Asher said. I'm putting it where it can do its work. Her fingers hovered near the key but did not touch it yet. For the first time. The old relay line did not feel dead. It felt waiting. Three Forks slept under a low ceiling of cloud. From the ridge above town. The cattle barn looked ordinary. Long roof. Dark walls. One lantern burning near the loading chute. A few horses stood in the lee of the fence. Heads down against the wind. Nothing about it, said Vault. Nothing about it, said Empire. That was how bad men preferred their kingdoms. Mara lay flat behind a fallen pine with Asher beside her. The brass relay key cold inside her glove. Below them, Nolan and Bram waited near the dry creek hut. Kit held the pack horse farther back among the trees. Theo stayed with the sealed mailbag. His coat wrapped around it as if paper could take fever. No one moved until the barn door opened. A man stepped out. Tall. Narrow. City coat. Square-heeled boots. Mara's breath stopped before her body could hide it. Julian Rusk stood in the lantern light and looked toward the road. Not the trees. He had always watched the obvious path first. That had been his strength and his weakness. Asher noticed the change in her. That him? Yes. Can you face him? Mara kept her eyes on Julian. I have been facing him for 20 years. Tonight, he finally gets to see it. Asher did not answer. He only touched 2 fingers to the snow. Then lifted them. The signal passed down the line. Nolan moved first. Not toward the barn. Toward the old relay pole behind it. That was the part Julian would not expect. Men like him guarded doors. Wagons. Strongboxes. And roads. They forgot that a message could enter a room without opening it. Mara had written the words herself on a strip of paper no bigger than a matchbook. Voss says close the ledger. Rusk included. It was not a lie large enough to prove. It was a lie small enough to be believed. Nolan reached the broken relay box and worked the old key they had repaired at the line shack. The signal moved through the private wire, still hidden under years of weather and neglect. Inside the barn. Someone received it. A minute passed. Then another. Julian turned sharply toward the barn. The lantern near the loading chute swung once, as a man inside opened the door too fast. Voices rose. Low and urgent. Julian stepped in. Mara pushed herself up. Asher caught her elbow. Steady, but not holding. You wait for my mark. He said. No. She said. He will not come out for you. Asher's jaw worked. She looked at him then. This is not me choosing death. This is me choosing the one door he will open. He let go. Mara walked down the slope with one hand pressed beneath her coat. Not to hide a weapon. But to keep herself upright. Every step pulled at old pain and new wounds alike. She did not hurry. Hurrying made fear visible. At the barn door. Julian turned. For the first time in 11 years. Brother and sister looked at each other in clean light. Mara. He said. No one calls me that who sold me. His face tightened. Not guilt. Not yet. Something closer to insult. You should have stayed buried. You should have made sure I was. Behind him. 2 men shifted near the stalls. Asher appeared at the edge of the doorway. Bram and Nolan came in from the side. Not rushing. Not shouting. Kit moved the horses away from the front fence. Theo carried the mailbag like a preacher carrying a Bible. Julian looked from one Crow brother to another. You brought ranch hands to a ledger house. Mara stepped past him. No. She said. I brought witnesses. That word did what threats could not. The man near the loft ladder froze. The bookkeeper at the table turned pale. Mara pointed to the trap under the third stall. Open it. Julian gave a small laugh. You think I take orders from you? No. I think you just received a message saying, Hiram Voss has decided your name belongs in the same book as mine. The laugh died. For one heartbeat. Julian was a boy again. Hearing footsteps outside a locked room. Mara saw it. She hated that she saw it. She used it anyway. He will burn you with the rest. She said. Unless you stand where the law can see you first. Asher stepped forward. Placing a folded marshal's warrant on the table. The seal was real. The timing had been hard-won. The marshal himself waited with men from the depot road. Close enough to hear a signal. Far enough not to scare Julian back into loyalty. Julian looked at the warrant. Then at Mara. You want me in chains? I want you alive long enough to speak. The barn went still. At last. Julian reached down and pulled the iron ring hidden beneath the feed trough. The trap lifted. Below. Under lamplight. The books of the iron choir waited in their dry wooden shelves. Mara did not smile. She only took the brass key from her glove and set it on the table. Seal everything. She said. And for the first time, the men who had built their power in silence heard their own names begin to answer back. By morning, Three Forks knew something had broken open. Not a bank window. Not a barn door. Something deeper. The marshal came before sunrise with 2 deputies. A rail clerk from the depot. And a gray-haired judge who looked as if he had not slept since the war. They did not shout. They did not drag men into the street for a show. They carried seals. Canvas sacks. Ink stamps. And a ledger list Mara wrote with a hand that trembled only when no one was looking. One by one. The books came up from beneath the cattle barn. Railroad waybills. Brand registry copies. Telegraph codes. Receipts signed by men who had spent years smiling from church pews and bank windows while other people paid for their comfort. By noon, the judge ordered the barn sealed. The sheriff of Three Forks was relieved of duty pending inquiry. A bank clerk who had stamped 3 false foreclosure notes was escorted from his desk without ceremony. At the depot, a notice was pinned beside the freight window. All disputed freight claims, cattle brands, bank notes, and land seizures connected to Hiram Voss were to be reopened under federal review. That notice mattered more than applause. It meant a widow could bring back a paper no one had believed. It meant a rancher called a liar could ask again. It meant a freight man who had kept quiet out of fear might finally say what he saw. Julian Rusk stood beside the marshal with his wrists bound in front of him. He did not look at Mara often. When he did, she did not look away. You could have let them bury me with the rest, he said. Mara folded another paper and handed it to the rail clerk. I did not save you, she said. I saved your testimony. Julian lowered his eyes. That answer hurt him more than mercy would have. And she was glad it did. Before sunset, Hiram Voss was brought down from an upstairs office above the freight house. He did not look like a king then. He looked like a man surprised that paper could weigh more than fear. There was no cheering. People watched from windows, wagon seats, and the shadow of the depot roof. Some looked relieved. Some looked ashamed. Some looked angry that the world had changed without asking their permission. Mara stood beside the sealed evidence wagon, wrapped in Asher's dark coat because the wind had found its way through her own. The judge approached her. Miss Veyne, he said. Your testimony will be required in Helena. I know. You understand your own name will enter the record. It belongs there. The judge studied her face. Some people will not call that courage. Mara looked toward the freight house, where Voss had disappeared behind a guarded door. Then let them call it late. For the first time all morning, her voice shook. Asher stepped near her. He did not touch her. He did not claim her. He only stood close enough for her to know someone had chosen not to move away. She looked at him. I am not clean, she said. No, Asher answered. The word landed plain and honest. Then he added, "But you are here. And today. That made other people safer." Mara looked down at the brass relay key in her palm. For years, she had thought justice was a door barred from the inside. Now she understood it was more like an old wire in a storm. Broken in places. Buried under snow. Useless until someone did the hard work of finding both ends and joining them again. Spring came late to Coldwater Spur. It came first as dripping water from the relay cabin roof. Then as mud under the horses. Then, as one brave thread of green beside the old telegraph pole, the Crowe brothers repaired the relay office plank by plank. Nolan restrung the east wire. Bram fitted a new door. Theo kept coffee on the stove for anyone working past dark. Kit painted the sign. Badly. Then painted it again after Mara read it aloud and raised one eyebrow. The final sign did not say welcome. It said, "Coldwater Relay Office Messages Sent. Witnesses received. Records preserved." Asher hung the brass key on its old hook beside the telegraph table. For a long moment. He did not let go. Mara stood behind him. "That key belonged to Peter," she said. Asher nodded once. "He was 17 when the winter route took him. You blamed yourself. I opened the door too late." Mara looked at the repaired wire stretching toward the hills. "Then open it early now." Asher's hand dropped from the key. That was all. No speech. No grand forgiveness from the dead. Just a man letting an old piece of metal return to its work. Mara sat at the telegraph table. Her fingers hovered above the key. "You leaving?" Asher asked. "I thought I was. And now?" She looked at the line. Then at the evidence copy stacked beside the table. Ready for the next witness who might come through Coldwater Spur with shaking hands and no one to believe them. "I.O. messages," she said. Asher nodded. Mara tapped slowly. Each mark, careful. Each pause earned. Witness alive. Name spoken. Send the others home. The line hummed faintly. A reply did not come right away. Then the key clicked back. One word. Received. Mara closed her eyes. Not forgiven. Not finished. Received. That was enough for the first day. Asher placed the last piece of cornbread from supper beside her elbow. Wrapped in a clean cloth. She opened her eyes and looked at it. Then at him. "Is that a question?" she asked. "No," he said. "Just supper." Mara touched the brass key once more. Then left it hanging where it belonged. Outside. The thawing wire sang softly in the wind. And this time. The message carried. This is a fictional story created for educational and entertainment purposes. All characters, events, places, and situations are imaginary. Any resemblance to real people, living or dead, or real events is purely coincidental.